So I've been working with Rachel Webster for over a decade now at the university. I'll read out her official bio. Professor Rachel Webster is a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor at the University of Melbourne, who has recently led campus and public advocacy for unlocking Australia's geothermal potential, including a funded project to design a geothermal heating loop with industry partners and University of Melbourne colleagues. That was the one I just presented there, the Smart Geothermal Industrial Loop. Rachel co-authored widely read pieces on geothermal as the clean, natural nuclear energy beneath our feet, highlighting pathways for 24/7 low-carbon heat and power in Australia. Rachel also engages the broader community through talks and media, outlining opportunities in places like Victoria's Latrobe Valley and discussing national potential with fellow experts. So I'll hand the floor to you, Rachel.
First of all, thanks very much, Graham, for the introduction, and also to BZ for inviting us along. Although I may have gone before Jay, I think it's actually quite inspirational to have gone after Jay, because it really demonstrates to us where we've got to go. And I drew the short end of the straw, if you like, and I'm talking about policies and regulations. And probably this is the area where we've got the most to do in the short term. So I'm going to explicitly deal with the Victorian regulatory context, because that's what I'm mostly familiar with. But what I'm speaking about mostly applies around Australia, more or less. And the issue we're facing is that most of the regulations we're dealing with were put in place before the potential uses of geothermal were really understood. And they're not really optimized. They're certainly not optimized for the sort of project that you've just talked about, Jay. We would have zero chance of implementing something like that. And while there are acknowledgements within government that things need to change, and there are very slow changes occurring, there's clearly a lot more to go. We've got a long way to go. So if you could move on, BSAD. So I'm just going to talk really about the three geothermal regimes that we essentially have to consider in Australia. The first one is domestic scale, which is essentially just direct use for ground source heat pumps. And this could be single buildings, or in some cases, it's even moving towards district heating. This is essentially unregulated space, but it does require planning approval. But one of the major issues here is that geothermal is not recognised as a renewable resource, and therefore people have some reluctance, or they don't really know how to deal with it. For example, it doesn't contribute to building ratings when you want to get a rating for whatever it is you're building. And so what this means is that there is no pull from the regulations to install geothermal. It's really left to those who are enthusiastic about it. Now, the second area, if we move up in scale, and these are the ones that Graham was talking about and Jay was really talking about, really what I call commercial extraction of heat from aquifers. So we're really using warm or hot aquifers to do larger scale studies. In Victoria, these are defined as resources above about 1 kilometre and less than 70 degrees centigrade. And there are current projects in Victoria, and Graham described some in Western Australia for aquaculture, hot spas, swimming pools, and also some buildings. And then the third option that we have are deeper resources capable of commercial electricity generation. There are none of those currently operational in Australia. And so those in Victoria, those would be defined as below 1 kilometre and greater than 70 C. Obviously, you need a bit more than 70 C to generate electricity efficiently. Now, if we move then to the regulatory framework that we have, there are actually 5 acts of the Victorian Parliament that have direct bearing on the use of geothermal. So we've got the Geothermal Energy Resources Act, and that's really about those deep geothermal resources. And essentially, that space it's pretty static at the moment. The licenses were issued about 20 years ago, and nothing has happened, and a lot of those have lapsed. If we move on then, BZAD, to the next slide. So these are the 5 acts that we have to deal with. And I'm not going to go through the details of these, but really what I'm wanting to illustrate is that if you want to do something, it's a complex environment. The most important one here is, or the 2 most important ones are down the bottom there, the Water Act and the Environment Protection Act. And what they govern between them is the use or potential pollution of underground aquifers. And there's really, as I note here, there's no consensus about what pollution means with regard to water that is reinjected within the aquifers. And of course, that is an absolutely critical issue for what we want to do. So if you could just move on then. So the issue we have, and I'm going to talk exclusively now about the hot aquifers, is that most of the water licenses that we have, certainly around Victoria, and this is, I think, increasingly happening elsewhere in Australia, are fully allocated. And so what that means, the solution then is to obviously use the water, remove the heat, and then re-inject the water, i.e. we have zero water usage when we actually access these aquifers. The problem then becomes, what condition is the water returned in? And this is where our regulations tie themselves up in knots a bit. In Victoria, we used to have to get ministerial approval to return water to the aquifer, and that's really a very steep requirement for any sort of development. Last year, they developed some guidelines that now allow you to return water to the aquifer, but it's a very complex algorithm, and you still are required to get 4 different licenses. And of course, the most complex ones that we have to get are environmental licenses, which have yet to be tested. So in other words, we have regulations, but for somebody who is wanting to implement them or to actually build something, we don't actually know exactly how they're going to be interpreted. Bizad, if you could go on to the next one. And I'm just giving you some idea of the sorts of things that we're dealing with. There's something called an Environment Reference Standard, which says geothermal properties of groundwater must be maintained for future and current users of the resource. Groundwater quality must not diversely affect troglophonia and styglophonia that depend on groundwater. Now, these are extraordinary requirements for somebody who is literally wanting to develop a simple groundwater loop where they take heat out of the water that they bring to the surface. Of course, all of us are very positive about protecting the aquifers, and we absolutely want to see them protected into the future. But of course, they are heated from below, and when we take heat out, we can be quite sure that they will, in fact, that will be regenerated on reasonable timescales, which we can effectively model and calculate. But the problem we're facing really, certainly in Victoria and more widely across Australia, is that we have some regulations, but we have no guidelines at the moment for potential investors or people with reasonably limited resources to deal with these sort of technical regulations. And of course, that's an impediment to developing geothermal projects. So if I just move now to the summary, certainly compared to anything that Jay has shown us and what we know about in Europe and parts of Asia, the harnessing of geothermal resources in Australia is really still in its infancy. But we take a lot of inspiration from what you do, I can assure you. We obviously, our situation, as is true everywhere, relies on what we've got below the ground here, what the opportunities are. And so we have to develop our own specific solutions and designs for the use of geothermal. But our current regulations and policies are really not designed with the sort of opportunities that we know are available. They're not designed with those opportunities at the forefront. And so it's making it very difficult to both implement and promote the extraordinary possibilities of geothermal that we know exist in Australia. And if you go to the last slide, I think there's just one more slide, Bizad. This is where I think we have a somewhat unique opportunity to actually de-risk these geothermal opportunities for early adopters. And this is exactly what we require at the moment, is people who are prepared to put up their hand and say, hey, there's a geothermal system I would like to develop here. Can you help me with some of these technical issues to smooth the way through the regulatory forest? Thank you.